Welcome to Project Book Club, where UFOs and UAP have close encounters with morning coffee. Grab a fresh mug and enjoy our steaming hot takes on this month's book that deals with anomalous phenomena. Brand new, classic, and often controversial. We talk about the ideas and we read between the lines. Now here's Bryce Zabel in Hollywood and Chrissy Newton in Toronto.
Welcome back to Project Book Club, which I almost said Project Blue Book, right?
Well, you did before we got started, so we're off to the races here. Yeah.
This is my third time doing an intro. But Bryce, it's so good to see you. I know that we are a little bit off in our releasing our dates because we had to push it back a week. So I have to say I missed both you and Tyler a lot.
We missed you. I mean, you kind of get in a rhythm on these things and it's like you're visiting with friends and it's good. I like it. Anyway, it's good to see you. Are you in Toronto right now?
I am. Yeah, I'm in my studio, but you are not in California. Where are you?
I am in California,
Okay.
but I'm not. I live in Los Angeles, not there right now. I'm in San Francisco, where I have to tell you, you think about, remember, Mark Twain, well, I think he famously said something about the coldest summer he ever experienced was a winter in San Francisco. So, you tend to think San Francisco is going to have some tough weather. It's beautiful right now. It's like 73 degrees, perfect skies. It's just fantastic. So going to stay here a while, but yeah. And besides which, when you do a podcast, it's like have Mike will travel, right?
Mm-hmm. I know that feeling. I've done a podcast when I've been on the road with you as well. But I'll say one thing. San Francisco, the first time I ever went is when I went to Seoul last year. Seoul just happened in Italy this year, but the first time I ever went. And I remember getting off the plane and I was actually shocked. I'm like, it's so beautiful. And I shouldn't say that I shouldn't be shocked that it was beautiful, but there's something to San Francisco. It has like this air to it. And, it's right off the coast. It's not so much beachy, but it does have that fisherman vibe. It has so many elements to it that I forgot that, there was a port city. And then obviously in the distance you have Alcatraz, which I tried to go on the night tour, but I couldn't get a ticket, unfortunately. But there's this air in the city.
It's a terrific place.
Yeah, it's really
and
wonderful.
Remember, they used to build, by the way, you'll get an occasional, we're doing some construction. I'm here in my San Francisco condo, and we're doing a little construction fix right now. So you may see some cameo appearances. But one thing about San Francisco that's cool is, remember, they used to build ships here. I mean, during World War II, they were building ships. And so a lot of these locations were taken up by that. And then after the war, some of them became free, and the city is constantly reinventing itself. I'm a I started in Oregon. I was an Oregon boy, but now I've lived in California so long. I just love it all. I love the state. I love being in LA when I'm there. I love San Francisco when I'm here. It's just it's a fun place and generally good weather. So you got to like that.
I agree. California is my favorite state in the US as well. I love it deeply. That's why I try to get out there as much as possible, especially in the wintertime, because it's way too cold here. And then once you're a Canadian and you step into California, you just have like a new step, like a new pop in your step.
Absolutely true. And I don't know why I'm thinking of this, but we, my wife, Jackie, and I are thinking about going to do Christmas markets in Europe in December. And that sounds kind of romantic and fun and Christmassy, but I know it's going to be so cold, just so cold.
Oh, it's going to be cold, but you do have to go to Germany.
Yeah.
Because Christmas and Germany are like they're hand in hand.
Well, apparently the big Christmas market in Europe is Munich. So they end up in Munich to check all that out. Anyway, what's interesting, Chrissy, I know we've got another book we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about Mirage Men by Mark Pilkington, but I got to say, before we get into that, I think we got to talk a little bit about our last episode.
Okay. So I'm going to ask Jesse Michaels this. Like, Jesse, I love you. I'm like, we are acquaintances. We're friends in that way. I've known we're all in the same beat, talking
Yeah,
about
we are.
UAPs. We're all trying to do the same thing, is truth and transparency. But I have to ask you, Jesse Michaels, did you take the cue from us to focus on Dan Sherman? Because it just seems like a big coincidence that when Bryce and I decide to do a book, podcast around this book and do an episode, that 2 weeks later, you have Dan Sherman on your podcast. So, fair is fair, in disclosure. So more power to it. And I haven't been able to watch it yet. So I'm looking forward to it.
Well, I will. I'll be honest with you. I mean, the book, of course, is Above Black by Dan Sherman. And even as we were doing that podcast on our last episode, we were saying, hey, Dan Sherman, if you want to explain what's going on with your life, come on down. Because part of the problem I was having as we prepared for our episode is the clips that you could find of Dan Sherman on YouTube were like, they just looked horrific. And I just thought, I wonder what the guy's up to right now, et cetera. And I will say, I haven't watched, first of all, I don't even know how Jesse Michaels does it. He does 3-hour podcasts. I mean, get out of here. That just sounds like a lot. I mean, wow. So I can't say that I have listened to all 3 hours of the Dan Sherman podcast on Jesse Michaels, but I have listened to the first, mostly the half, and then the last part of it. And honestly, a couple of things. First of all, as I just said, I'm a boy from Oregon, but that's also how Dan Sherman describes himself. But then he goes on to say he's been in 20 different countries or things like that where he has been in the service. But the main thing about it is, I just wish I had seen Dan Sherman at this length, this up close, at this quality prior to our thing, because I don't know that it would 100% change everything I thought about his book or him, but he certainly comes across very honestly. He comes across as a guy who's trying to relay his experience. Some of my comments from the last one are still true. I mean, he can prove that he was in the service and that he was at all these places that he said he was, and that's all true. But it doesn't also get to the heart of the matter, which he says Black projects are in place and they provide the cover for gray projects. So, and the gray projects are the alien projects. I mean, I don't want to get into another episode about Dan Sherman, Chrissy, but listen, he makes a strong case for himself. He seems relaxed. He seems comfortable. And Jesse, for his part, seems very well informed, and he had his researchers working on it. I don't care what got him to do it, to be honest. If he got it because he watched I'd be thrilled. In fact, if he did, I'd love that. But even if he didn't, I think it's good that he did this interview, because based on just the book itself and some of these old clips, I think you almost have to reject the Dan Sherman book. But when you see this 3-hour interview with Jesse, you then aren't rejecting his book without thinking about who he is. And so it put him into perspective for me. And I'm certainly, honestly, I'm a little more willing to believe it's the real deal, having seen him.
Yeah. And I'll say one thing, spending time with Jesse, I've had lunch with him in Austin, and I've talked to him. At other times, I ran into him at Seoul. I've met him at dinner in Los Angeles once. And the one thing that Jesse is, he's a really wonderful conversationalist, but he also really does understand theories extremely well. I know Jesse's background is finance and many other things, but I wonder if Jesse's in his former life, if he was a scientist, or if he just, did something with science, because he deeply understands theories really well. And I do respect that. And I've had conversations with him where sometimes I'm like, wow, you're so well read. So I appreciate that. He can do a 3-hour conversation and be able to hold up with any other scientist that he knows, because he will read about the theories and he will do his best to be able to communicate them to his viewers. So I respect that.
Like I said, though, I don't know the guy, and I wish I did. He seems like a really cool guy, Jesse Michaels. But I will say this, he seems like he has a photographic memory. I mean, I hear him doing these interviews and I feel like he's just got a command of certain facts that, I mean, I have a command of a lot of facts, and so do you, and so do, did Ross Coulthart when I was doing Need to Know with him, and so does Richard Dolan. But he just seems like he committed like he could read a book and commit it all to his head, which is not something I do easily.
Yeah.
I will say, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
The one thing I was going to say, though, and Tyler Astral, our producer, did bring this up when we had a conversation at the end of our last podcast, the three of us. Tyler, you made a really good, I've been thinking about this for a while, actually, because I've been reading so much recently for the past year or so about government programs that have been used UAP or has used any different types of, theories to be able to cover up governments, targeting civilians, right? And I deeply love this topic in context that I feel that the government has done that, and we can see that through MKUltra and multiple other programs that the government has done. So Tyler, I believe it was Tyler, you brought up a really good point saying that maybe Dan Sherman was told that narrative, that it was the ET hypothesis or it was ET, and it was actually the government that he was speaking to. And to me, that almost sounds very plausible because they've used it, and this book will lead into Mirage Men, right? It's a perfect lead in, I guess, to that. Didn't mean to do a segue, but it makes me wonder.
Honestly, remember in our last episode, yes, that's one of the things that I was, I don't know whether Tyler said or I said, whatever,
sorry, maybe you
but
did
I just
say
remember thinking when he was telling that, he didn't have any actual evidence that he actually was speaking to an alien intelligence. He didn't actually have evidence of anything other than he had recollections that he was looking at a computer screen and he appeared to be having a conversation with somebody. But that doesn't mean that he was actually having a conversation with ET. He could easily have been having a conversation with some PSYOP person in the US military who was testing what will happen if we try to con somebody into believing he's talking to ET, and Dan Sherman wouldn't have known that either. So
he wouldn't have no idea. And to me, that sounds way more plausible because we're seeing that forms of telepathy and this conscious connection between humans is possible, right? And we're learning more and more about it, and more scientists are researching it. So it makes sense that when Dan was in this program, that they already had an idea of different forms of telepathy or different types of communication that are nonverbal. So to me, I don't know. Again, I maybe changed my perspective. I don't know if it's aliens. The more and more I read about UAP adjacent to government programs, the more that I realize, and it saddens me every single time I find a new program that the government has used the UAP narrative to create more misinformation and disinformation. It leads me to believe that UFOs are so much smaller than, I would say 1%, but now it's even less in my perspective. And again, this is not like a skeptic perspective. This is not a debunked perspective. I think it's just the amount of information that I've been learning over the years. And as we do these we read these books, I start to learn more and more and more. And this is the best thing about being in a book club, is that your perspective changes and you have new theories and you can connect dots. Like I literally called our friend Dan McClure. I can't say, I will say this. We were told something when I had dinner with Joe Rogan, and right. And I can't say in respect to him or respect to that meeting when that happened earlier this year, but I literally was working out, like pushing weight. And
good for you.
Right. I'm like, I'm 42, gotta do that. And so I realized I literally got up from pushing weight and stopped and messaged Dan instantly and said, what was told to us is actually a really weird connection to what was happening in World War II. And it was connected to this book. And I know I'm being very vague about it because it's fair that I am, because it was a private meeting and it was a private conversation that we all had. But again, I stopped and I went, wow, like my perspective has changed once more, and I have like another little clue to go into, my clue box, that as I'm looking at misinformation and disinformation and I'm connecting these dots since I've, been a really young kid, it boggles me and it makes me sadden again, but it also then makes me realize that the military industrial complex has such a handle on us, and I wish it didn't, but it's immensely has changed my perspective consistently.
I'll say this for myself. I do believe we are dealing with NHI, non-human intelligence. But if Jesse, I haven't, like I said, I haven't listened to all 3 hours of it, but if he went 3 hours and didn't ask Dan Sherman, how do you know that you weren't just communicating over the computer with another human being? Then that would be a miss, because that is something I would want to ask him right now. Let's talk about our new book that we're going to be talking about today, which is Mirage Men. And it's by an author named Mark Pilkington. And Chrissy, I just have to say something about this book club concept. And by the way, I wish I'd brought my coffee cup with me up to San Francisco. So you're the one that has to do the Vanna White and show the colors there. Very nice. Very nice.
Get yours on.
When I get these books and we decide at the end of an episode, well, why don't we read this? And so at the end of the last episode, you said you got to pick, and you said, we're going to read Mirage Men. Excellent. Love it. I've owned the book.
Mirage Men. I didn't pick Mirage Men. Did I?
Yeah,
no,
you did.
You asked me to pick from the two.
You did. You picked Mirage Men.
I did. You're right. But you asked me to pick from the two. I actually brought 2 books here for you to pick. But
that's very funny, because you most certainly.
This is what happens when we don't spend enough time together, Bryce.
It turned out, by the way, that I own a copy of Mirage Men, so I was happy to finally get around to reading it. Here's the thing. Once you said that, I immediately, I own Mirage Men as an Audible. I own it as a book, and I own it as a Kindle. So I set about reading it, and I read the whole thing or listened to it or whatever in like maybe 10 days. But that was a while ago. And so I find the way my memory works, I'm not a steel trap where I remember every detail forever and ever, or even for the short term. So now here we are, maybe 40 days out from when we said we were going to read it. I read it so quickly that I realized as I was getting ready for today's show, I'd forgotten half of what I'd read. So I had to go back and almost reread the book a second time to pick up all the details. So I think the only thing that I can do is to go back to what I did in college, which is wait till the last minute to prepare for the test. Maybe what I need to do is read these books in the 3 days before we record. Maybe that'll get me by.
Well, I respect that. I can't read a book in 3 days. Unfortunately, it's too hard for me. I've been reading it throughout and listening to it throughout the course of the month. So I'll take breaks when when I'm doing it. And then I also write notes, and I know you do as well. But I should tell my story about Mark and I.
Yes.
I've actually met Mark. Yeah. So this is funny. As most people know, Alejandro, who owned the International UFO Congress with his partner, Karen, love them both. I think they're such wonderful people. And Alejandro when he ran this conference, when I went in my 20s, I was 25, I'm 41 now. We won't talk about
that. How brave of you to say your age.
25 when I went.
Braver than me.
I was young and chipper, and and was probably the youngest one there. To be honest, I was one of the youngest females there, being around the age of 25, 26. And I think the second year that I went, and I didn't know Alejandro at that point. I just knew that he ran the conference, and there was like over 2,000 people there. It was huge. And I go in to listen to a presentation, and it's this guy named Mark, and he's talking about misinformation and disinformation in the UFO community. And he's speaking about his book and about the research that he's been doing around Richard Doty and Paul Bennewitz and Mirage Men. So I stopped, and I've never heard this before, right? When I was 25, I've never heard this at all. Again, I'm learning more. I'm understanding maybe the ET hypothesis. That's kind of where I'm at. So I'm learning more about national security and government as I'm listening to Mark. And I think I remember being almost front row, and people were just screaming at him, yelling at him. I believe people were coming onto the mic, and ufologists were coming up. Oh my gosh, I'm forgetting his name now. Nova Scotia. So, so I'm listening to Mark speak, and as UFO researchers are coming up and are just yelling at him and calling him a disinformation agent, and they're saying that he's lying and who is paying him. And I'm shocked at this point because I'm like, what is going on? And how could somebody put themselves in this position going to a UFO conference saying these things? Like, he's in such a position, in such a vulnerable position. And so instantly after he's at his booth and he's signing books or he's talking to people, I went up to him and his friend that was with him, and I said, would you have a drink with me after? Because I'd like to speak to you. Not really knowing what I was going to ask him, because I think I was more in shock. And when I sat with Mark, I think he probably looked at me, and I will be interviewing Mark actually in the next couple of weeks, because I did reach out to him to jump onto my podcast. And I think he probably looked at me, at this 25-year-old young woman, and went, wow, she's really interested, but I don't think she really knows that this might be going on. And so I had a lot of questions, but I remember just looking at him, and I was so confused, because I was like, how could this happen? How could the government do these things? And I remember him and his friend just looked at me and were like, this is true, Chrissy. And I think I stepped outside of myself for a little bit. And since that time, I've really looked into misinformation and disinformation because of Mark. He was the first person to introduce it to me. And I feel very lucky that I had a chance to sit with him. And one of his close friends that he speaks about in the book a lot is Greg Bishop. And that is one of my closest dear friends in Los Angeles. And they have worked together. And I never knew that until I read this book, that they have worked together for so many years. And I have so much respect for both of them. So that is my little story about Mark and I. But I think that he's such a wonderful writer, and I wish he would do another book.
The other thing he could have been thinking is, holy crap, a 25-year-old woman wants to have a drink with me. I'll do it. I don't.
Well, he was with another female too. It wasn't just, I don't know if it was his partner or whoever it was. So I just remember them kind of looking at me. I felt like this really naive, young 25-year-old that is just staring and, looking into this ET hypothesis and looking at things like crop circles, because I was interested in, and very naive. And for sure, as you learn more, that naivety goes away and the ignorance goes away. But Mark was really wonderful. And I was surprised when he said yes, to be honest, because I think if anything, it was more refreshing because he knew that I wasn't going to yell at him.
Well, who among us wasn't a little more naive than we are whenever, at 25 than we are wherever we are? This is the other book you're talking about, Project Beta.
Yes.
And this is the Mirage Men that Mark wrote. I don't remember meeting him personally, but I might have. I've got a book signed by him where he says to Bryce, they're coming, watch the skies, very best, Mark Pilkington. But obviously, I got it in 2010 or around then when this book came out, because I had written that book with Richard Dolan. Before we get too far into this, though, let me just say a little bit about what this book actually is about. This is Mark Pilkington. He is the author of a book called Mirage Men, A Journey into Disinformation, Paranoia, and UFOs. And the essence of this book is it's an argument that for decades, the U.S. military and intelligence services have seeded and steered UFO mythology, that they were the ones behind it. Sometimes they did it to hide classified programs, sometimes to test psychological operations. That would be pretty much what we were just talking about, Dan Sherman. And sometimes because individual operatives enjoyed the game. That would be this Richard Doty character we're going to be talking about in a minute. But the book is told through this time-honored genre of a road trip. So he's on a road trip with his friend through basically American ufology. He ends up at a UFO conference in, I believe, Laughlin. And And the book also, the reason it's got to be sometimes compared to as a companion piece to this other book I was talking about, Project Beta, because they both take on this case of Paul Bennewitz. And Paul Bennewitz was the guy targeted by Richard Doty, who worked for the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. And it's kind of viewed as a deliberate deception that still shapes UFO lore. So the thing is, I'm reading this thing and I have some opinions. Is there ever an episode where I don't have opinions? I do have opinions. But first, I want to hear let's set the stage for what the book is about. Do you want to add anything to that brief little description there? And also, while you do, Chrissy, I know that you have talked to Richard Doty. You actually had him on your show before, so you might want to tell us about that too.
Yeah, exactly. I've interviewed Richard Doty. How it started for me was obviously Mark, and then I became really good friends with Greg Bishop. And then I've been deeply interested in, and I say this all the time, all roads lead back to Doty. They really do. We've heard so many different whistleblowers, but when you really look into all the information and the history around UAP, it leads back to Richard Doty, unfortunately. I really liked this book because I'm, as a public relations professional, started in that, and now I obviously work in media. But for 17 years, doing PR, I see misinformation and disinformation in spin because it is one of the things that public relations does. And PR has a massive handle, which most people maybe don't realize, on national security and on the UFO topic. We talk about national security, but within national security, the spin within communications and public relations is so apparent. It controls the narrative. And this book really does touch on that in so many different ways. It talks about Project Serpo. It talks about the Psychological Strategy Board that was part of the CIA, that was formed in 1951 from President Harry Truman. It speaks about so many different types of eras and misinformation and disinformation projects that have affected the UFO community and the UFO topic, along with talking about Richard Doty and Paul Bennewitz in the 80s and how multiple letter agencies were targeting Paul Bennewitz, not just Richard Doty. And the questions are why, and why were they using the UFO narrative, and why were they targeting specifically one man? And the other question is, was Paul Bennewitz being targeted with multiple different projects outside of the one that Richard Doty was told? Some people think that maybe Paul Bennewitz was targeted with MK Ultra as well, and he was an MK Ultra victim. There is no evidence of that, but his behavior at the end of his life really did point to it, because he ended up having multiple breakdowns. He said that Paul Bennewitz said that people were climbing into his house and injecting him with fluids in his arms, and there was injection marks on his arms, and people weren't sure if he was doing it himself or somebody was doing it. And both Mark within Mirage Men in this book and Greg Bishop within Project Beta do reference that they did see a ladder, or did see some type of, not damage, but maybe some type of, I don't know what the word would be, but it looked like they were trying to climb through potentially a window, and that was in Paul Bennewitz's window. So it was tampered with in some way, and they did see that. And it's referenced in both books. And I asked Richard Doty that, and Richard Doty told that to Paul Bennewitz, but what he said to me in my interview is he doesn't remember any of that, nothing. So the one thing that Mark does make a comment at, and Greg Bishop did say to Mark when they were speaking and doing research in the 1980s around the Paul Bennewitz case, Greg Bishop does say that Doty always slightly changes the narrative just a little bit so that you might not even catch it. And I think I am a prime example of that. When I interviewed him, he slightly changed that narrative. He's told two people this, it's been referenced in two books, but he told me something different. Now, I will say this, you end up almost liking Richard Doty. I really grilled him in my interview. Like I grilled him pretty hard because what I felt he did to Paul Bennewitz is he had a choice to be able not to do that. And he did that, even though he was really young. He was like 22 or 25 when he had his first counterintelligence mission to do this to Paul Bennewitz. But at the end of the day, he had a choice to say no and not to do it. And he decided to do it. But there is something that ends up happening is that you see that Richard Doty feels bad and he really liked Paul Bennewitz. And you do see a man when you interview him that was, is very sad for what happened. And so you almost, it's not like he's repenting, but you do feel bad for him. But I think that is the one thing that Richard Doty knows how to do very well is bring you on his side. And
that's what he's trained to do.
That's what he's trained to do. Yeah.
I was just going to say, if people want to look at Richard Doty and come up with their own impressions, that of course they can watch your show, but also just to make it clear, Mirage Men was also made into a documentary shortly after the book came out, and Richard Doty's all over that. So you can actually look at Richard Doty and go, do I think this guy is a straight shooter or not? And I found that to be useful. I didn't mean to cut you off. Did you have something you were finishing up there?
No,
okay.
I'm so passionate about the Richard Doty story and Paul Bennewitz because it's so important for every single person to know who's researching UFOs because it's not the Richard Doty story and Paul Bennewitz is not just about UFOs. It's about how governments affect civilians and how this actually happens. And it's not just within North America, it's around the world.
This is all true. Let's be really clear, though. Project Beta is 100% Bennewitz and Doty.
Yes.
I mean, if you want a deep dive, read Project Beta. Mirage Men has that as a central part of it, but it's really more than that. And I have to tell you, I'm not as big a fan as you sound like you might be for the way this book is presented. I want to say what I liked about it. I did think it's an interesting narrative of UFO history. And what I mean by that is that he's sort of walking us through the UFO storyline. And for that, I enjoyed it. But he's extremely selective about what things he puts in and only puts in those factoids that bolster his thesis. However, Mark Pilkington is also a very fine writer. I mean, as a writer, I enjoyed reading his work. I thought it was good, and he seems like a decent guy. But interestingly, though, this is what's so weird about the disinformation world is you could also argue that while he's trying to blame all of ufology on disinformation, he could also be a victim of disinformation that fed him that. And I have a pretty open mind about that because, and I'm not going to get into the story right now, but people that are watching this and you, Christy, know this, that during Dark Skies, Brent Friedman, my co-creator, and I were approached by someone who said they were from the Office of Naval Intelligence. And so we immediately, and this was something that happened like literally during the premiere party of Dark Skies. And all I remember was our initial take was, well, he seems pretty authentic. All right. Could be the real thing. But at the same time, we had to ask ourselves, or this is just disinformation. And for whatever reason, the government has ginned up somebody to say that he's from ONI and he's here to tell us the story. I guess, Chrissy, the thing that kind of made me less of a fan of the book was that in telling these certain cases while he was running us through the world of ufology and some of the high water marks of it and some of the cases, he cites all the disinfo, which of course is the topic of his book. And that's fair. I mean, that's the topic of his book. He's entitled to do whatever he wants, but he completely leaves out certain positive evidence. And so it doesn't feel like a fair fight. A specific prime example for me from his book would be Roswell. He makes a case for disinformation, but he leaves out the 600 witnesses who said opposite, who have told all the researchers from Stanton Friedman to Don Schmitt to Kevin Randall and all the others that they saw something, that they were aware of something. And so I feel it's a very selective book. It leaves me wondering, Chrissy, when I read it, why he did that. I mean, in other words, if you're going to write sort of say, here's the Roswell case, wouldn't you kind of want to say, here's what people believe and why? Here's why it might be disinfo, and let people make up their own mind, or at least take a point of view. Because, and I'll just finish with this, the thing that really irks me about this book is I devoted my time to watching the documentary. I read the book in multiple formats. I've studied it. And at the end of it, he still got his feet in both sides of it. He still is not telling us, I think it's all disinfo and I don't believe in aliens. Instead, he's got this thing at the end where, well, it could be, and it just seems squishy to me. It seems squishy.
I like that. It's squishy. I think what Mark is trying to do is saying there's so many people that are so connected to their belief, right? Like it only can be this, and then they double down, right? They double down, and he talks about this in the book. When somebody says something to someone and gives them evidence that maybe their opinions are not right or correct, then instead of following the new information, they double down on their belief system, right? And that says a lot about a person that's not flexible. And so what I think Mark is trying to do is call out all the things that he feels from his perspective. We have to remember this, it's just his perspective, but in his time of researching what he experienced and who he spoke to and the programs that he was prevalent to that potentially could be misinformation and disinformation. I think that he's trying to wrap them up and say, hey, by the way, that everything you believe is probably not as accurate. And here's a couple cases that I can show you that have major holes in them. And that's how I took it. Like Project Serpo, right? It's such an interesting story. And again, back to that conference, I sat beside one of the men who wrote that book. My dad did, funny enough. My dad sat down and started talking to this guy on the left of him. And I looked to my dad and I was like, who's that? He's like, he wrote Project Serpo, Chrissy. And I'm like, no way.
Okay.
Like, no way.
Wow. All right.
And I was like, come on. And so then after my dad went and bought his book, and I remember I said to him, I'm like, oh, you wrote it. And he said, yes, I did. And so at that point in time, again, as 25, 26-year-olds, you're like, you're still learning, what is Project Serpo? I've never heard of this. And so I think that Mark does a really good job about calling out the historical facts that show that Project Serpo was not accurate. It started from, unless I'm wrong, and please correct me if I'm not, it started from a university as a sociology experiment to see if this information would spread. I believe Mark does speak to that.
Well,
and the university.
It could also be, I mean, how many people believe Project Serpo because Steven Spielberg made it the ending of Close Encounters of the Third Kind? I mean, that is Project Serpo in a 100%. Nutshell.
And it's all in the same time frame, right? Everybody is referencing and reading this stuff and they're being influenced it. Your book or your show was referenced. I remember, so I texted you and I was like, you made a cameo in the book.
That brought a smile to my face whenever you're referenced like that. Here's the thing. And I just wanted to quote it. He basically is arguing in this book that the UFO phenomenon in its modern cultural form is a deliberate, and I use that word deliberately, it is a deliberate blend of secrecy, intelligence manipulation, and human storytelling. And again, what that doesn't answer is, okay, assuming I think that's all true, do ETs exist or don't they exist? Does NHI exist or doesn't exist? He's playing at both sides there. He's basically saying it's all this stuff, but well, maybe. But I would just say, if I was in a room with Mark Pilkington right now, and maybe someday I will be, I would say, hey, Mark, come on. What about all the radar returns? They can't all be faked to look like UFOs. What about the pilots that are seeing things out there? and saw them in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s before you could blame this on our technology or Russian technology. What about all the witness accounts? What about the experiencers? What about, and I would just go on a what about? What about this? What about that? Because you don't get that from his book. He's not saying how many hundreds of thousands, if not millions of cases are out there. He's sort of not talking about them because it doesn't go with his thesis that it's all a big disinformation campaign. And I don't think it is.
Well, I don't think everything is, but I think what he's saying is that the government uses the UFO narrative to be able to cover up projects that they're working on. And so we've seen that. We've seen that recently where they said that pilots, right? And do we believe this when it comes from, the Washington or the Wall Street Journal? Do we believe that? This could be debatable, but saying that pilots were told that, they were viewing some form of ET craft potentially or working on projects that related to it, but it was all misinformation because it was being compartmentalized. I don't see that Mark is doing that here. I find it's the opposite. I think that he's trying to call out things that are misinformation and disinformation. But I do really think that Mark believes that there is something going on. He might not stress that as much as possible. But here's the thing, and I will clear this up in our next podcast because, and please tune in everybody for the next one after this, because I'm going to interview Mark. I literally reached out to him and I was like, Mark, I sent him a note and said, hi, it's Chrissy, this 25-year-old you met years ago. Would you like to jump on my podcast to speak about what's happening today and what you think is misinformation and disinformation? Because I would like to hear his perspective on what is currently happening right now. I think he has a really strong voice.
He does, and
he makes some really great points, and he has really wonderful evidence to back his thesis.
Yeah, but see, okay, I don't want to get in too much of a corner here, Chrissy, but the truth is, I understand there's disinformation. I mean, clearly, disinformation has always been part of any military. I mean, certainly in World War II, we disinformed the Nazis about where we were landing in D-Day. It's not like it's a surprise to me. So, of course, there's disinformation. And the Benowitz case, absolute disinformation led to really negative consequences. So I'm willing to believe in all the disinformation, but I also believe there is an underlying reality to non-human intelligence. But so I'm willing to believe in both. I believe in disinformation. I believe in NHI. And so the question that raises a different question for me. My question then becomes, okay, if NHI is real, why is the government disinforming us that NHI is real? That's the part that makes my brain explode. Whereas what he's doing in his book is the opposite. He's saying, disinformation is real. Who knows about this alien thing? And I just think he's wrong. I think if you study the facts that deal with NHI, you have to come to the conclusion that something anomalous that ain't us is active in our world. Now, you may disagree with that, but that's where I come from. So when I read this book, I felt it was a little disingenuous.
Ooh. Okay.
Don't you love it when we have these moments?
I do. I know.
I know what your brain is saying. Here's Bryce calling this guy disingenuous in his book, and I've got him on my podcast.
Well, no, that's fine. You're allowed to have your opinion.
Yeah,
that's totally fine.
That's what makes it a book club.
Exactly. And the one thing I'll say is there was something that Mark said, and I never knew this. And I looked at it from a media perspective and a public relations perspective, and I never hear about this at all. The Psychological Strategy Board that in 1951 that President Harry Truman was overseeing, and it was dealing with propaganda efforts during the Cold War. And that was happening in 1951. When did Life magazine come out with its piece? It was 1947 with Kenneth Arnold, which is really, really interesting because if a lot of people do not know this, and I did not know this until I read this book, that Life magazine was attached to the Psychological Strategy Board that was run by the CIA and multiple letter agencies. So, what that is telling me now, and what that is alluding to, and we don't have evidence that the Kenneth Arnold story or any other story that's related to UAP was sent and used as misinformation and disinformation to cover up or to propel a CIA agenda, right? We don't know that, but we do know, and we do have evidence that yes, Life magazine was attached to this strategy board. That says a lot. And the reason why is that Life magazine in the 1950s and in the 1940s, but specifically in the 50s, was used to talk about culture within America. It was the one thing that you read. It was the one thing that you ran up to, and everybody in the 50s had it. If you weren't listening to the radio, you were going to grab your Life magazine, and it was syndicated. And that was what was informing you on culture. And so most of the time, people emulate their culture or they speak to it. And that's what was happening. And so right there, you have the quickest way of spreading misinformation and disinformation instantly. And when you know that it is influenced by the CIA, I'll never read Life magazine ever again now. Ever. I'll never look at an old publication and trust it. And that's what just shocked me. And I'm still, I think about it after I read this probably once a day now.
Well, okay. I mean, you can hear all the traffic outside. Listen, I don't, like I said, I believe disinformation has been a real thing. And I believe the CIA has been up to its eyeballs and doing things they ought to have been doing over the years. Let me just ask you a question. Do you think there exists NHI operating on Earth or not?
It's so hard. I kind of go back and forth all the time, but I do think there is non-human intelligence. Do I think that it's extraterrestrial? That's kind of what I go back and forth with. I'm not so much connected to the ET hypothesis like I was when I was younger. My ideas have changed. I look at things at more interdimensional. I think that it can be multiple things. We can put ghosts into NHIs, right?
Of course.
So I do believe there is something here, but to thinking that it is aliens, I do not know.
I'm not talking about aliens. I'm just saying.
No,
do you think there is a non-human intelligence operating? Might be extraterrestrial, might be interdimensional, might be based here on Earth. But is there an intelligence interacting with humanity today in recent times, going back to World War II?
Yes.
Is there an NHI interacting with us that is anomalous and not us?
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. Well, so that's my point. I feel like.
You don't think Mark's saying there isn't?
No, I don't think he's saying that at all.
I don't see that.
What he's saying is, who knows? He's saying almost everything that we take as an article of faith about things that have happened, he's saying, yeah, that's all explained by disinformation. I think that, first of all, I think the guy is really brilliant. I think he's a smart guy. And as I said, a good writer. So and in order to write this book and have it researched the way he's done it, he clearly knows what the order of battle is in this whole ufology thing. So all I'm saying is, I think if you really, most people that really get into it understand whether there's disinformation or not, they understand there's an NHI involved with us right now. And he seems to be going out of his way to deny that. And so what I would ask you to ask him when you do have your interview with him is, do you still feel the same way 100%? Or has everything that's happened since 2017 started to change your mind a little bit? Are you a little more open to NHI? And I wouldn't make NHI mean alien. It does not mean alien. It might be alien, it might be something else, but not us. And so I'd be curious about that, because I still go back to the thing that just left me with my head exploding, which is, okay, if it's all disinformation and there were no aliens and it's disinformation to say that there are aliens. I mean, if there are aliens, why would the government disinformation plan be to tell us there are aliens? And there's only one reason for it. that all this technology that's flying around in our skies is actually ours or our adversaries, and they don't want anybody to really know about that. So they imply it's NHI or it's alien. But that just couldn't have been true in the 40s and 50s. The state of technology was not that advanced.
Well, I did a podcast. One of my first podcasts was with somebody who formerly worked at Area 51 and speaks about when I got off the podcast with him. He said, Chrissy, is this recording? And I said, no. And he said, drones have been operating way before the 80s, Chrissy. He's like, way before. And so he was like in the 50s, 40s and 50s. And so he could have been feeding me a line of BS. Let's be honest. But it was interesting that the last thing he said to me is he had to make that point. And I thought that was really interesting because people are like, well, drones never existed in the 80s. Well, they didn't when it came to the commercial perspective, but they did from a defense perspective. And Mark talks about that when he speaks about silent helicopters as well. So right. I do agree with you. I think that, and I'm going to clear this up.
Okay. You get to the bottom of this, will you, girl?
What he thinks, because I'd be curious.
Yeah.
There's one other thing that I thought was so interesting was the MJ-12 perspective that he has, right? And I have a little info nugget to add to that story. Okay. I'm going to go get it. Give me 2 seconds. Hold on.
All right. I'll just kind of vamp here. First of all, I don't even know what Chrissy is about to tell us or show us, but I actually believe in the MJ-12 documents. I've built dark skies around them. I take it as an article of faith that they are an accurate thing. Now, she's about to tell us, I think that they're not. Okay. Stanton Friedman was a very good friend of mine. I optioned his life story at one time, spent 30 hours talking to him, and he was pretty strong on them being authentic. So I'm going to go with authentic. But as a Hollywood storyteller, of course, Christy, they don't have to be authentic. I can still write about them forever and a day. But now, okay, I filled the time gap. Here you are back in your seat.
So I will say Stanton Friedman was the one that yelled at Mark on the mic.
Oh.
When I was at the conference. Yeah, he got up and started calling him a disinformation agent and was yelling at him.
Okay, now I don't, just so you know, folks, I don't approve of that behavior. I believe in enlightened conversation where people can have different opinions, like you and I may have a different opinion on this, and you remain friends and collaborators, and it's the clash of ideas that yields truth. So I'm in favor of all that. I'm not in favor of berating somebody at a microphone. So yeah.
No, I agree. And I think he was passionate. And I interviewed, Stanford Friedman like years ago in Toronto too, or gosh, it was like 10 years ago or more, rest in peace. He's such a wonderful man, and he deeply cared so much when it came to MJ-12 and so many other different topics around UAP, and he did his due diligence. So now yes. With this story, when it comes to MJ-12, so when my dad was about 18 or 19, I think I've said to people who know me that my father had a UFO experience up in Northern Ontario near Pembroke, Ontario, with a group of people. So for years after that experience, my dad was trying to figure out what was he seeing? What was it? Was it some type of national security piece? Was it actually, a UFO from maybe extraterrestrial? Like he didn't know, right? He was so young too. He was 18 years old. And for that longest period, I know his friends were very interested in UAP as well. And so my dad would talk about with them secretly, because there was so much stigma still when I was growing up. Like we would talk about it at the table, but my dad would say to me, you really can't talk about this with the average person, Chrissy, because they're going to think you're nuts. So my dad's best friend, Daryl, was a trucker. And in the 80s and in the 90s, he would truck around North America, but he was Canadian. And the story that he told my dad was that he picked up a hitchhiker one evening, and this young guy was like about in his 20s, probably over the age of 25, and he had a backpack filled of stuff, right? And so he was telling Daryl that his father worked for the American government and that his father was killed because he was working with MJ-12. And he brings up these documents.
Right.
So these are original documents from the 80s. Oh, I think I froze here. Sorry, hold on.
Well, they do give us a chance to look at these documents. And by the way, just so everyone understands, those aren't the original documents. And in fact, no one has seen the original documents. They were photographs of supposed original documents mailed to two people in the 80s.
So these are documents that are original from the 80s, though. Like these are pieces that were photocopied, yes, but we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So 8, it says here, top secret, Majestic 12. And so he gave this to Daryl and said, my father was killed working on this project, and I'm trying to let everybody know about it because it's obviously his dad. Yeah. And so for the longest time, my dad kept these in the safe of our house, and he would only bring them out once in a while for people to read at the dinner table. And so we would pass these around because we didn't know if they were real. We thought they were original. And so at one point in time, the FBI comes out, and Mark talks about this in Mirage Man, that these documents were fake and that the FBI was trying to figure out the original source and who wrote them, but they had the heck of a time. And Mark says that maybe potentially Richard Doty wrote them. He's not really sure. And so there is no actual source of who wrote the document yet. But now the interesting thing I thought about, and I'm surprised that I still have these and that my dad kept them, which I'm happy he did.
I think that's very cool.
It's very cool.
By the way, for people who are listening to us as a podcast, what I'm looking at right now is Chrissy is holding a frame. It's a transparent frame, but on one side are 4 pages, and on the other side are 4 other pages of these alleged Majestic 12 documents.
So, yes. And so now here's the thing, and you can read these online, right? You can go and read them now online if everybody wants to. But we had these for the longest period of time. Now, I said this to Christopher Mellon once at dinner, and he wasn't sure as well. And I still ask this question, and probably why I'm so very intrigued with misinformation and disinformation. What an interesting way to spread disinformation when the internet was not available commercially, is that you get a young guy that's working for the American government, and you put him as a hitchhiker, and you put a whole bunch of documents in a backpack. What an interesting way not to be able to track, but to spread misinformation and disinformation.
Well, but
it's like the perfect way to do it. And it ends up in Canada.
Well, it's certainly
so for me, this could potentially be evidence of an American government, somebody who's working with the American government, spreading misinformation and disinformation. And this is actually one of those original papers, potentially.
It could be. And although the way it came out in the first place was a little weird, which is these 2 researchers, Jamie Shandera and William Moore, received a couple of rolls of film. And when the film was developed, there were photographs of these different pages, and those became the Majestic 12 documents. So in other words, there was never an original document for someone to go to the paper stock and analyze it, or to look at the actual typeface to see if it had been struck by a typewriter at a certain time. So there's no able to do that. And they sat on them for several years as they investigated them. And Stanton Friedman was part of that team at that point. They had brought him in to help them. And they eventually released them, and they believed that they were authentic. And, we could probably do an episode on Majestic 12 documents. I'm fascinated to see that your dad got those, and the way he got them seems very interesting. Again, I don't want to come across as the guy, well, Bryce will believe anything, because that's not who I am. I'm pretty skeptical. I'm skeptical of some of these books we've read, not because I'm skeptical of the topic. As I said, I strongly believe NHI has been, messing around with this for a while. I just don't believe everything that's been said about it, for the very reason that we're doing this show today. There's so freaking much disinformation that has been visited upon the UFO UAP topic over 8 decades that it infuriates me. However, I look at people like Christopher Mellon, who you just mentioned, and I say, I don't think Chris Mellon's in on any government program to disinform anybody. He seems like a straight shooter to me. And there are many other people, Ryan Graves, people like that. There's just a lot of really tremendous people who are researching right now. And they're not saying it's all disinformation. They're saying it's an authentic, anomalous phenomenon, and that we need to pay more attention to it.
I agree. And I agree with that statement wholeheartedly. And I do think that there is something happening, and it's been happening for a very long time, if not since the beginning of our civilization. And so I do think that we have to keep asking questions. And I know that recently it was spoken about at Seoul that the conversation was had that maybe this part of disclosure has stopped. You know, we know that it happened in the 80s,
Right.
we had a whole movement, and that potentially this era of disclosure has come to a close. And I think the word disclosure is overused in many ways. Personally, I think that we will always be an ever disclosure, and I think I've said this consistently. I think that it's a great marketing tool. To be honest, as a PR person, it's a brilliant marketing tool. But I do think that we should stop using the word disclosure, and we should start just always be championing transparency no matter what in everything we do, and stop labeling it as something, and just unite it within ourselves and to others that we have truth and transparency. I think that's why, and I do call the UAP community or subject as a counterculture, because I do think it's a movement of people that really do want transparency and they do want truth. But I think we have to stop labeling it as disclosure.
I'll cede you all that. I just because it's time to wrap up, but I just want to. Here's what I think. Two things can be true at the same time. It can be true that the government has outrageously used disinformation against its own citizens on this issue, and that infuriates me. At the same time, it can also be true that NHI are very real, have been real, and form an underlying core truth about what we're dealing with right now. I think that they can both be true. And so in a way, if I'm going to say anything, it would be Mark Pilkington has half the story. He has the disinformation story, and he's not wrong about that. He's not wrong in his book that disinformation has been laid upon us in an unconscionable way. He's not wrong. I just think that he got a little tentative about the actual core story. Is there a truth to it, and there's disinformation on top of it? Or does the disinformation prove there isn't much to it? The book, as he writes it, leads to the latter conclusion. He's saying probably not that much to it. And that's why when you have him on your show, you're going to ask him, for me and for you, if he's changed his opinion about anything.
I will, 100%.
So it's time to wrap up, though. And
yes.
And as we started this show, you pointed out that it was you who actually picked Mirage Men. So that means, in the grand scheme of book club, I get to pick the next one. And
well, I have other options here if you want to just.
No. You know the rules. What do you got? Oh, all right. You know what? That's very funny. You
want me to show you what I have here?
Hold up the first one. Hold up.
I have.
Okay, that's my pick. I didn't. Chrissy and I. No. Put the other one down. That's over. Chrissy is holding my pick, and it's so ironic that you picked it as well. Our next book is going to be Communion. The reason I think it needs to be Communion, Chrissy, is that, Whitley Strieber wrote it. He's like a lion in winter right now. I mean, I love Whitley, don't get me wrong, but he's a man of a certain age, as am I, of course, but he's a lion in the winter. He's a strong, powerful voice. He's an intellectual about this, but he has one crazy story that set the world on fire when it came out in 1987. And he's written so many books since. There's been so much talked about the whole experiencer. But by the way, it wasn't called experiencer back then. It was abduction. All right. And I think it's time for us to read Communion with a fresh set of eyes, knowing what we know in 2025. I want us to go back to 1987 and read that book that set the world on fire and ask ourselves, did it get better or has it not aged so well? And I think that'll be a good show.
I agree. And also, what a compliment to have Christopher Walken play you in a film. Like,
although, listen, we both
Such
know Whitley Strieber. I don't know Chris Walken, but I know his work. I don't see him. I mean, it's a fine choice of an actor for a movie.
Yes.
No problem. I mean, he's really intriguing, and I think the studios probably said, or whoever the producers said, he's got such an edge to him, this Walken guy. It'll be perfect for a UFO alien movie. But I don't see him at all the way I see Whitley Strieber. Whitley Strieber is a Texas gentleman. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. He's a lovely guy, right? And to the extent that what has happened to him, as he delineates in Communion, is true, then he's been through a world of hurt in these 40 years. He's been through a lot. And so I say, let's go back to the beginning and see if there are any telltale signs in that book or if it stands its ground.
Agree. So Communion it is. I won't bring up this one.
That'll be you can pick that next time.
This one I was looking at Operation Paperclip.
Yeah.
And it was adjacent to UAP. That's why I thought I might decide.
It's a big book. So
Annie Jacobson. Yeah. But Communion it is.
Communion it is. All right. So folks, I'm going to sign out from San Francisco. Chrissy, always a tremendous fun thing. I hope people that watch this don't say, so I get it. Chrissy is the nice one and Bryce is the one that complains about all the books. I hope they don't think.
You know what? It's a good change because when I did my show, I was the bad cop. So, nice change over here.
Listen, I mean, again, it's possible that many things can be true at the same time. So we'll leave it at that. But anyway, I'll see you next month.
See you next month.
See you, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Project Book Club is produced by Bryce Zabel and Tyler Stevens and is brought to you by Stellar Productions. You can learn more about us and what we do at projectbookclub.net. We appreciate you and hope you'll spread the word. See you next time, because every book you haven't read is a new one.